Welcome back to Senior Savvy Cannabis. I'm Katherine Goldberg. Today, we're joined by Jason Thom to talk about the curing process. Jason, thank you for being with us. This is a part of the cannabis evolution that not everyone knows exists, especially people who just buy it at the dispensary.
Right.
So, can we start with some basics? And can you just tell me what does cured cannabis mean? What is the curing process? Is that different than fermenting? And what else in nature is cured that we consume?
Okay. So three parts to that large question, and and that is, you know, what is curing and don't why doesn't everybody know about this? Well, the answer is curing has been used in a lot of other smokable herb products, tobacco for one. Now, if you take away the different ingredients, they're both smokable herbs. Okay. And the difference is the tobacco industry has been around for almost 300 years. So there's a huge evolution and a huge refinement in what they do. And also, it's been legal. So you got to look at cannabis as being the younger brother of tobacco, and it's still stuck in the prohibition mindset. So if you look at alcohol, I mean, when alcohol was illegal in the States, was anybody making scotch? Okay. Reason is who the hell wanted to keep their ill-gotten gains around for 12 years until it turned into scotch?
Hmm.
No one. So everything was moonshine, out the door as fast as you can get it. And that prohibition mindset is what's infected the cannabis market. So, if you look at what happens as a market grows into legalization, there's refinements that happen. So, this happened in alcohol, this happened in tobacco, and this will happen in cannabis. Um, and as soon as you step out of the mindset of the prohibition, you realize that uh, there's an evolution that cannabis can go through. Now, how does this occur? Well, because the plant is not dead when you chop it down. Okay. The plant still continues to process at a cellular level. And we've had a number of products that are refined and improved by root cellaring. This is allowing them to age. Cheeses, wines, scotches, many things that are stored in a root cellar actually improve over time. Okay. And with the cannabis plant, if you keep it in a very particular temperature and humidity range after it's harvested, it will continue to refine its biochemical profile. So, one of the main things that happens is chlorophyll is removed. Okay. Chlorophyll is what makes it green. And eventually, everything in cannabis world will be cured to some level. And just like I don't know if you've ever grown tobacco or seen it grown, but when tobacco grows, it's green.
Oh.
Okay. How come nobody smokes green cigars? How come nobody smokes green tobacco in their cigarettes? The answer is because chlorophyll sucks. Okay. Chlorophyll is what makes things harsh and unpleasant and makes it smell like hay. So there's two processes to curing. You have to do a proper drying process. If you dry too fast, if you don't dry in certain climatic conditions, you don't set the plant up for a proper cure. So the first thing is a very long, slow drying process. And in fact, when I went down to Cuba, they actually, when they're drying their leaves, they will actually inject humidity into the room
Hmm.
halfway through the drying process. So there's the drying process, which has to be a long, slow process, usually one about 3 to 4 weeks. This allows the trichome head, which is basically sap surrounded by a waxy coating, to actually dry slow enough that you don't get cracks in the trichome head. Okay, what uh, reduces the effectiveness of tetrahydrocannabinol, the active molecule in cannabis, is oxygen and UVB light.
Hmm.
Okay, So if you can stop oxygen exposure and the UVB light exposure, you don't get any degradation in the THC. Now, the other point is once it's dried properly, and then you put it in the right climatic conditions for a cure, is there is essentially three in the tobacco industry. There's three ways to cure. Uh, One is sun curing, one is water curing, and the other one is air curing. Okay, sun curing and water curing are not applicable for cannabis because obviously those are deleterious to tetrahydrocannabinol. Okay, the only one left is air curing. So that's where you do small batches, and this was done in the 60s in California. People would bury their ill-gotten gains in mason jars in the ground and dig them up a year later, and it'd be all brown. Now, a lot of people think that this is just garbage, but in actual fact, it's a much superior product. I mean, you're talking about the difference between Scotch and moonshine. You
So,
know, it.
so, so let me ask you a question.
Yeah,
Um, and you'll have to excuse me. I don't drink alcohol. So, but I get like one is like
right.
terrible and then one is like refined and
Yeah, I
fabulous.
don't drink either. Just FYI, but
But it's a good
that's
analogy because
right,
it
right.
it helps us put it in context.
Yeah, yeah.
So, uh, let's just say maybe not maybe a long cure isn't for absolutely every cannabis consumer, or you may believe it is. So what I would like to address is that I'm a big fan of sativas.
Yep,
I like terpinolene. I
yep,
like THCV. I
yep.
want that strong sativa. What my grower does here without your intellectual property and your this
Mm,
long age cure is that the cure is maybe 6 months.
yeah,
6 weeks to 6 months.
yeah.
And by the time I get it, it's green and the flavor is dense. So what are some of the consequences of curing for, let's say, over a year? Is THC being converted into CBN, or is that?
No, so
Yeah.
good question. Good question. So, I mean, this is part of where you get into some IP stuff. It took me about 14 years of refinement of the process to create Kiro. Okay. Um, my prediction is in the cannabis world, everything will be cured eventually, much like in the tobacco world, everything has some level of cure. Okay.
Is that where
The
we are now, though? I mean, I know they're cutting
No,
corners.
because
Yeah.
if it's green, it's not cured. So in order for it to be called cured, you have to have the chlorophyll completely removed out of it. And this is a huge improvement in the smokability. And if you have the conditions correct in your small batch cure,
Mm.
okay, you won't have any degradation of tetrahydrocannabinol. What you'll actually have, and you pointed out that because the plant is still processing in this very narrow window, you get too dry, it stops processing. You get too moist, and mold spores will grow. You get too hot, mold spores will grow. You get too cold, the process slows down. So there's a very small window.
Is that what
Where
your intellectual property
Yeah.
basically covers?
Well, I mean, people will figure it out, but
Yeah.
there is some information around there
Okay.
that if you keep it in this very narrow window, it will continue to improve biochemically over time. So actually, I don't know if you're familiar, but there's three forms of tetrahydrocannabinol: a delta 3, a delta 6, and a delta 9 molecule. Only the delta 9 molecule is psychoactive. Okay. So the plant actually improves 2 to 5% over the time of harvest in potency. How does this happen? Because the lower forms of tetrahydrocannabinol are converted to a delta 9 molecule. Okay.
Interesting.
Um, and the thing I want to address is erroneously the whole industry talks about strains. This is ignorance in pure form because there's no other industry where the commodity is secured through strains. It's all going to be blends. In the tobacco world, in the wine world, in the liquor world, it's all blends. And why? Because blends can be secured through IP. For example, in the tobacco world, a master blender will go through the curing room and he will choose different strains of tobacco, and that becomes a brand. Okay,
Like
so for
pheno
example,
hunting, but in on the tobacco side of
well,
things.
so imagine a master blender going through a curing room in cannabis. And what we have for Curo is we have like five different blend brands. Okay. Now, in wine, there's a lot of blends. They don't care about securing the strain of the grape. Okay. Same with alcohol, same with tobacco. The master blender goes through and picks a variety of strains, but nobody knows what ratio the strains are, how much of this, how much of that. And the reason for this eventually happening in the cannabis industry is it will be blends, because blends can be secured. You will call your blend, say you will like a particularly elevated one. So maybe you'll call it Cerebral Sunrise. Okay. This will be a brand. Now,
So, just a question. So, with the, what does the COA look like once? Because obviously, on a COA, it's not going to be like no one's doing genomic sequencing to tell you what strain it is, but it's going to at least tell you the cannabinoids and the terpenes so that
yeah.
you can make an educated guess onto how that. So,
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, this will be one of the things is that one of the other things I'm sure as a longtime smoker or imbiber, we all know, anybody who's smoked for years knows that doesn't matter how potent a strain is that you get it originally, in about a month and a half, you're going to be normalized to that strain.
yeah, of
Okay.
course.
So we've all had, a strain where we've had it and it's like three or four puffs. Whoa, I'm good. And then a month and a half later, you're smoking two doobies just to get where you need to get, right?
Of course.
So the other advantage of blends is because you have different tangents or angles of cannabinoid profile, you're going to get always an effect. I've had ardent smokers who are like, oh, I can smoke, five at a time and I hardly barely get high. And unfortunately, this is something that's happening in the industry because everybody's racing to extracts. So when everybody's doing really potent stuff,
Mhm.
it makes you, I mean, a lot less affected by just regular full flower products. So anyway, this dovetails into another issue in the industry, which is depreciating inventory values. Okay, so what happens when you're a big producer is that your inventory declines in value over time.
Mhm.
Curing it will allow that to appreciate over time. It will become worth more the longer it's cured. So when you cure something properly, you bring out a lot of the profiles that are hidden when the chlorophyll and other things are there. So you don't, when you do it properly, you don't lose any terpenes, you don't lose any potency. Okay, you actually remove all the negative stuff while
Wow.
enhancing all the positive stuff. So if you ever have a curo, for example, it'll taste like you just breathed in a bouquet of flowers. Okay.
So
And
does
one of the,
Curo have a, tell me about the Curo energizing blend.
yeah, so one of the more popular brands with Curo is something called Cinco Damas, which is five ladies. There's five distinct blends in there. It tends to be sativa heavy
Mm.
for cerebral aspects. And a lot of the other misnomers, like a lot of, for example, a lot of people say, well, I prefer sativas.
We, I,
I, you
yeah,
know,
we're talking about the percentage of, THC
yeah,
plus terpenes.
well, this is my whole point, that the plant knows how to do it better than humans. So anytime humans get arrogant, we think we can just take out this and we'll take out that and we'll put it into a thing. We always screw up. I like to work with the plant consciousness actually, and we've grown stuff for medical patients where we've actually done communication with the plants by frequency induction into water that's specifically designed to create medicine for that person. And the plant is much better at doing this than human brain. Okay.
We've
So my
heard
point,
that as
yeah,
a common theme among, master growers
yeah,
is that they kind of reflect exactly what you just said, is they all know the plant knows,
yeah,
we are in service of the plant.
a
Um,
100%.
So I love that you can use technology
Mm.
and research and development to in some ways come back to basics.
Yeah,
And
well, it was weird convergence. My ex-wife was a botanist, and I have a physics background. You can combine a physicist and a botanist together, and you get some freaky stuff going on in the grow room. But to address some of this, my point was that a lot of people think that it's strain locked. Okay, so if you want a cerebral effect, you have to have a sativa. This is categorically not true. Okay. So indicas and sativas can have similar cannabinoid profiles. A lot of the, again, this comes down to prohibition mindset. For example, 2 years ago, I got a strain that was supposed to be harvestable in 8 to 9 weeks. It was a strain of OG Kush. Okay.
Mhm.
Now, I'm not a big fan of typical Kushes. I don't like the indica feeling. I find a lot of the Kushes being much too THC potent. And
Mhm.
this is what happens when you get too much THC and not enough other cannabinoids to balance it out. You get the paranoid feeling, you get, the anxiety, you get the stresses. This is because of an unbalanced cannabinoid profile within the plant.
Mhm.
So we took this strain and we took the strain to 14 weeks. No, it's not supposed to go 14 weeks.
Mhm.
Okay. But we just kept really, we didn't hit the nitrous on the plant. We didn't feed it. We didn't stuff it full of phosphorus. Phosphorus is a cellular accelerant.
Mhm.
So a lot of the things that are done in the grow room actually cause early senescence. This is called early aging in a plant. It causes the plant to rev up so high that it ages out early. Now,
Mhm.
this is desirable when you're in prohibition, because think about it, prohibition is you want the crop
Happens
off as
fast.
fast as possible,
Yeah.
right? But it's not really the best results. Okay. So what we found with this Kush when we took it to 14 weeks was all the trichomes were white to slightly amber. Now, this is very important because a lot of the trichomes that are harvested early will be clear.
Right.
When trichome is clear, it's going to be more predominant THC, and a lot of the other cannabinoids, which we're just now finding out have a lot of very important functions within the brain and the endocrine system. So, again, when you try to maximize it, it's akin to alcohol. If you try to just make something the most alcohol possible, is that really the best consumption experience? The answer is no. I mean, you don't make wine the most potent it can be. You don't make scotch the most potent it can be, because that's not the totality of the experience. So a lot of these ignored cannabinoids, these lower forms of cannabinoids, CNCs, CBDs, all these kinds of lower forms actually have a synergistic effect to the THC. Okay, and when it gets out of balance, this is when you start having problems.
Mhm.
So when people are doing extracts and it's just 100% or like 80% THC, well, that's when you start getting some issues.
And CHS,
Right,
potential psychosis.
right,
This is what we
100%.
warn against.
Right, 100%. And this happens because we, in our ignorance, are taking out what we think is the important thing and ignoring these lesser things that don't seem to have an effect. But the actual fact is they do. And this is why I'm a proponent of whole flower cannabis. I,
Mm.
I think when we separate things out is when we start running into problems. When you leave everything like a symphony together and
Holistic.
balance it right, holistic, that's when you get the best medicinal and best recreational results. So what we found happening with this OG Kush was when we let it go 14 weeks, not only was the yield incredible in terms of size, weight, etc., but the quality of smoke was exceptional. People said, I don't know what this is, but whatever I need, I get from it. If I need to be up, I get up. If I need to relax, I get relaxed. And really, it was because the trichome heads were cloudy, meaning that there was a full bouquet of cannabinoids in that trichome.
Mm.
Okay. And with a lot of other plants, they harvest too early. And this creates an unbalanced cannabinoid profile. And then so people erroneously think that in order to have a cerebral experience, I need to do sativa. In order to have a pain suppressant, relaxing thing, I need to do indica. This is basically a little bit of misinformation based on a lot of erroneous prohibitionist thinking. Okay, and once we've had the time, so like for example, I don't use CO2 in the grow room.
Mhm.
Okay, a lot of people will say, well, that enhances it. Well, CO2 is also a cellular accelerant. So you can use CO2 in the early stages, like week 2 to 3, okay, of the flower phase. But if you use it later on in the flower phase, you're actually revving up the plant and causing its metabolism to increase. People who shove the plant full of phosphorus, for example, also increase the rate of maturation within the plant. So you're causing the plant to mature early. And then, of course, there's the misnomer, oh, you've got to starve the plant
Mm.
in order to get all the fertilizer out of it, right? So you give it water for 2 to 3 weeks. Well, when you starve a plant, you bring about early senescence. And ask yourself, in nature, does a plant ever starve?
Right.
Like if it's in the ground, is
It
it ever not having access to nutrients?
no.
Of course. So why doesn't it taste fertilizer E, or does it not have problems? Well, because the plant only takes what it needs. It's not being force fed, essentially, right?
So let
So,
me ask you a question. Humans have been, growing and using cannabis medicinally for
yeah,
5,000 years. It has only been recently that we've been rushed, that big business has come in, that corners have been cut, that
yeah,
this process has been adulterated, for lack of a better
yeah,
word.
yeah.
I was curious about if you know anything about the history of cannabis in terms of like were there ancient civilizations, not ancient, but like Chinese medicine, like they were using cannabis, were they using it fresh or like did they get the memo that maybe like it would serve them better if it was cured? And did like I it seems like I don't think you reinvented the wheel. I think you just made it better with technology. Is
Well,
that
100%. So number one,
is that
curing is
accurate?
something, yeah, 100%
Okay.
is that I observed this all came about through a serendipitous accident. So I had one of Canada's first federally registered nonprofit medicinal dispensaries back in the early 2000s.
In Canada, right? Just to give
Yeah,
everyone
in
context.
Canada,
Okay.
yeah, in
Okay.
Vancouver,
Okay.
yeah, and basically we had inventory build up, and it was being stored, in a root cellar conditions. Okay, and somebody didn't go through the inventory, and I went through the inventory one day, and I noticed something had gone yellow. And I was like, "Oh my God, we lost one of the best sativa strains, this Hawaiian strain." I was so angry, somebody wasn't doing their job, paying attention to the stock rotation. I got frustrated, and I opened this thing up, and what greeted me was this bouquet of tropical flowers, like almost like passion fruit and mango. And I was like, whoa, well, that's amazing. So I tried a little bit, sampled a little bit, and I mean, it was just the smoothness. It hadn't deteriorated. It was just refined. It was like holy smokes. So this
Wow.
began. This is like 17 years ago. This began the exploration into curing. Okay, and it was just so superior. And I mean, I'm talking about like you know it's almost not even going to be considered cannabis. I mean, it's like the difference between moonshine and, like I said, something, or like vinegar and fine wine. I mean, it's just such a huge difference that I was blown away. So then I went down to Cuba. Of course, I started researching it. So to answer your question, do ancient societies do this? Well, of course they did. They cured cannabis because number one, um, there wasn't a prohibition issue, right? So everything we've done in North America and largely around the world in modern times is because we're coming from a prohibitionist mindset. We're coming from a mindset of people who've done things in the closet and kept it all secret. And that necessitated a certain strategic mindset. You have to get things to market fast. You have to do things, quickly cut corners. You want to mature the plant. Nobody has time to see what the plant will do if it's kept in the right conditions over time. Okay. And now that prohibition is lifted, this will all come out. And by the way, I read a very important book, and it was about the story of the gentleman who created the modern Cuban cigar. Now, he was originally from Ukraine, and he came over to the Americas. His family was tobacconists in Ukraine, and he came over to the Americas, found himself in Cuba, and he is the reason for the modern Cuban cigar industry.
Hmm.
Okay, this gentleman. And this book is like the Rosetta Stone for the future of the cannabis industry. And really, the book isn't about tobacco, it's about how somebody created the culture to support a luxury brand.
Hmm.
And that's what's important as cannabis refines itself. And keep in mind, so, tobacco's had 250, almost 300 years to refine itself. And, cannabis has gotten, 15. Okay. So, cannabis is way down here. tobacco is way up here in terms of time to evolve.
Hmm.
Okay. And so they're a much more sophisticated industry. And, the bottom line is chlorophyll is what makes cannabis harsh. Okay. It's what covers up all the terpenes. The other component is that a lot of people believe that if, the ash color, if it's pure, the ash will be
What?
white.
Yeah.
Well,
Is that
this
a
is
myth?
really, yeah, that's a myth.
Okay.
Okay. Because that's largely indicative of the dryness of the plant. I mean, there is some potential in the ash to, if it's got still a lot of um, carbohydrates and other components within the plant matter. Oh, and this is another thing that happens when you cure. By the way, the carbohydrates are converted to sugars, so the it actually tastes sweeter. So the smoke will taste sweet. Okay, like you're drawing a breath over icing sugar almost. Okay, um, so what happens though is that because of this prohibition mindset, because of the rush to market, people are getting things out there that are still have a lot of chlorophyll in it. Anyway, so when you do cure it properly, after we have stuff that's 5 to 6 years cured, and it's like leather. Okay, so when you take the bud, you can squish it, and it's squishy like that. It doesn't crumble to dust. Okay, it's actually squishy.
Hmm.
And that's the thing. When I went to Cuba, you take these tobacco leaves are huge, right? Like they're like 2 or 3 feet in size, massive sheets. Well, when you take a 5 year properly cured tobacco leaf, it doesn't crumble, it doesn't crack and crumble. It's like leather.
Huh.
Okay, it has the consistency of leather. That's the outer wrapping that goes around the cigar. Okay, and that leaf is the most highly prized leaf of tobacco. That's called puro level, and it's you wouldn't even recognize it. So the same thing with cannabis if you cure it properly. And then there's something after you reach a certain point, you put in oxygen desiccants and you take the gas out of the jar and you put CO2 or nitrogen in there, and
To
this will
preserve
stop.
it?
Well, this stops any degradation because there's no oxygen in the environment, right? So then what happens is it's just small, subtle improvements in taste and quality. And we've taken the same strain, and I haven't finished explaining that one thing you asked, and I'm going to get there. But we've taken the same strain of cannabis, put it in 6 different jars, and
Hmm.
had six different environmental effects happen.
And what
Okay.
did you notice?
Well, all sorts of things. The certain terpenes like pepperdine comes out. So if you look at the Curo booklet, and this is the other thing we happen to do, not to do a shameless plug, but we have invented the modern cured culture. Okay, so if you look at the Curo book you've been sent or should have been sent, or will be getting, it has basically a taste profile parameter, and much like scotches or much like other things, there will be, say, peppery,
Yeah.
there will be sweet, there will be all these different bouquets that come out because of the individual cure. And this then provides a value, much like how in the wine industry, there's just a certain year of wine where the soil conditions, the grapes,
Mm.
certain things came together to produce the wine that isn't replicated. So this is why in the future, properly storing your inventory will actually be a way to enhance your value. Okay, and
So
go ahead.
yes. So we're about out of time.
Yeah.
I have free Zoom. So
Well, we can do if you don't mind, and you want to have more questions. I don't.
we,
I don't mind if you want to.
let have a follow up.
Yeah.
But I so appreciate what you're doing, and the reason why I wanted to have you on was because within the span of 1 month, someone from your team reached out about this long cure, and then someone from another company reached out about like a flash frozen cure
Yeah,
where
that's not a cure. Okay, so that's not curing. So there's a whole bunch of misnomers out there. Everybody's using the word cure, but they don't really know what it is. And so, no, you only get a cure when you allow the plant to sit and process in the ideal conditions over time. And if you fly up to Vancouver, I promise you that proof's in the pudding, right?
I might
So,
have to make a trip out there.
right, I think so. And we've had a money back guarantee for 17 years, and nobody's used it. Okay. So in terms of, and we're also the only people who get 50 to $100 per gram of cannabis. Okay.
We'll
That's
talk about that
22.
next time.
Yeah. So, this is why, if you've been doing something for 17 years and nobody's actually brought it back and said, this is garbage, this is, this
You're
is
onto
a
something.
proof, right? That, and people did this in the past. So in ancient India, they used this extensively. Now people say, oh, it wasn't as potent and whatnot. That's hogwash. Of course it was, and it was used medicinally. And yes, they cured it
Mm,
because they could, because it was really about what brings about the best product, not how fast do we get it to market,
yeah.
right?
And I think that's
Um,
where we are now. So I'm so thankful that you and your ex-wife, hopefully you guys have an okay relationship, or if not, that's okay too. But I'm glad the meeting of the minds came together at the right time in the right part of history where you were able to create this intellectual property. And it's so funny. I feel like I'm like a cave person, like, and you're kind of like from the future, and you're like, no, you don't get it. Like, this is weed in the future. It's so much better. You have no idea.
yeah,
So I'm open-minded enough to say that I would love to try it. And hopefully this is just the beginning of, a future dialogue and we can keep it going.
yeah, and I'll tell you what, fly up to Vancouver, come up to Vancouver. If you do not agree, I will reimburse you your expenses. And you can, so it will cost you nothing to come and sample um, what I believe is the world's premier cannabis. And we have trademarks, by the way, around the world. So
Mm.
this is what will be happening. Mark my word, there will be no cannabis in the future that isn't cured at some level
All
within
right, you
about
heard it
10
from
years.
Jason.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Appreciate your
Thanks.
time.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye. Okay, thank you so much. Oh, good.